You are very welcome to the Tortoise COVID inquiry, or I should say welcome back if you've been with us for the first two sessions of the day. My name's Marinisha. I'm one of the editors here at Tortoise, and for the next hour, we will be looking at who has been most let down during the course of this pandemic. Who have we failed the most? So there are, I think, three questions we'll be asking ourselves and the speakers who've kindly joined us today. Why did the safety net fail? Who was failed the most? And how could we fix it in the future or for the next time? So there's plenty to get stuck into, and I'm delighted to be joined by four excellent experts and witnesses who are able to talk to the subject. They are Marinisha Sulman from the Health Foundation, who's working on a COVID impact report there. Sir Michael Marmot, the director of the UCL Institute of Health Equity. Dr. Halima Begum, the director of the Runnymede Trust, and Baroness Hilary Armstrong, the former Durham MP, who's also chair of the House of Lords Public Services Committee. Welcome to them, but I should say before we get to them, two things. If you have any personal experience at all, any personal stories or evidence you would like to give, we do want to hear it. Please put it in the chat where my colleague Ella is there. Do talk to her. We will be collecting all the stories and things that people say in the chat. We'll make the transcript available and the transcript of this entire inquiry available. And so we are very keen to hear about relevant experiences. And I know that there are people who've contacted us with witness statements before who are joining us, who I do hope to hear from in a while. But first, I should say that we are, as in other sessions, starting with a legal argument. We're being joined by Professor Lydia Hayes, who is the head of the law school at the University of Kent. Hi, Lydia. We've asked you to help us understand the subject by setting out the types of communities we failed and the inequality of the COVID experience. So if I could hand over to you now to make those arguments, that would be great. Thank you, Lydia.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
Lovely. I wanted to start by recalling a groundbreaking book by Wilkinson and Pickett called The Spirit Level that was published in 2009. It showed that the more unequal a society, the greater its problems. It showed that it was the difference in income and wealth between the people at the top and those at the bottom within a nation. That was what mattered most to the social, economic, and human health of a population. It was the living of different lives because of inequality that made all the difference. Now, we know a set of facts about coronavirus. We know Black people are 3 times as likely as white people to die from COVID-19. Severely disabled women are 11 times more likely to die than non-disabled women from COVID-19. People with learning difficulties 4 times more likely to die from COVID-19 than those without learning difficulties. If we want to understand the facts about risk exposure and risk of death in the pandemic, we can follow the approach of Wilkinson and Pickett. And that would require us to change our question from why to what. What differences between the lives of men and women have been driving the 80% rise in calls to domestic abuse helplines that we saw during the first lockdown? What differences between the lives of people who are disabled and those who are not have cut short so many lives from COVID-19? What differences between the lives of Black, Asian, and minority ethnic people and the lives of white people make it more likely that BAME people will die from COVID-19? Now, the Office of National Statistics has pointed to some of those whats. It found a large proportion of the difference in the risk of COVID-19 mortality between ethnic groups can be explained by where you live or the occupation you work in. And it's true that our work, whether paid or unpaid, is a big part of the COVID-19 story. For women, those employed as care workers are the most likely to have died from COVID-19. For men, those employed as taxi drivers and security guards were more at risk of death from COVID than those in any other occupation. And there's a considerably higher percentage of the Black population than the white population who work as care workers, as taxi drivers, and as security guards. All three of these top risk occupations are low paid. So we've already arrived at a prima facie position in which gender and race and economic fortune combine as a backdrop to exposure to coronavirus and risk of death. Differences between lives are determined by the rules of the game, for want of a better word, and that game being surviving or thriving in contemporary UK society. It's true that many of the rules are found in social mores or culture or religion and class norms, but those rules vary by place and time, and they don't apply to all of us. But there is a source of rules that apply universally, and that source is the rule of law. The law is a collective set of rules by which we all should live. And the phrase "no one is above the law" communicates notions of legal equality. But legal equality does not necessarily mean a closing of differences. So here are three examples of law that may be driving differences, which I think may be relevant to the questions before this panel. Who was failed the most? In the UK, a person who works full-time is not legally entitled to earn a living at an income that is sufficient for living a healthy life. The national minimum wage is set by the statutory requirement that the Low Pay Commission make a recommendation to government based on the effect of any proposed rate on the economy as a whole and on competitiveness. It's not based on the income needs of workers who seek to live healthy lives. Now, does that sound like a system designed to make work pay? Or does it sound like a system that might exacerbate poor health outcomes for workers who look to the law for protection against low pay? The second rule is that should a worker get sick, as all workers do from time to time, the law doesn't provide universally for any income at all to be paid by the employer. Instead, it provides a set of statutory rules by which workers may be eligible to statutory sick pay at a rate of just under £96 a week. Now, depending on where in the UK you live, that's between 65 and 80% short of the income you need to live a healthy life. Now, does that sound like a system designed to ensure that workers who are exposed to coronavirus because of their work have the financial support which is necessary to enable them to self-isolate, to protect their health and that of others? The third rule is about health and safety. Now, we know that the provision and availability of personal protective equipment was a key issue in exposing or protecting some groups of workers from coronavirus and the extent of the viral load to which they were exposed, particularly in confined spaces like taxis and care homes and shopping centres. Regulation 4 of the Personal Protective Equipment Regulations 1992 requires all employers to ensure that suitable PPE is provided to employees who may be exposed to a risk to their health and safety while at work, except where the risk has been adequately controlled by other means which are equally or more effective. So we can see that this regulation carries strict liability, requiring employers to ensure provision of PPE, no ifs, no buts. However, amendments made to the Health and Safety at Work Act in 2013 mean that workers can no longer make a direct claim based on a breach of those duties. From 2013, they could no longer directly found a legal challenge. the Health and Safety Executive, which is the UK agency that promotes compliance with health and safety standards at work, its projected funding is £100 million less now than it was a decade ago. It's been required to pursue an agenda of deregulation, the simplification of health and safety law, and the exempting of large groups of workers from the scope of the Health and Safety at Work Act by the Deregulation Act 2015. We have no dedicated labour standards inspectorate in the UK, and we have half the number of health and safety inspectors per 100,000 workers than in France. So we might ask, does this sound like a system that will ensure the equal protection of workers' health, no matter what their occupation? I want to close with a quote from Martin Wolf of the Financial Times earlier this week. He said, COVID-19 has had a far more devastating economic shock than economists expected. And it's a huge lesson for us because an even more virulent disease is perfectly conceivable. For next time, people's safety should remain the supreme law of politics now and forever. I would respectfully add that some people are more safe than others because inequality is rife. And it is the differences between us to which we must attend in an endeavour to understand by what differences were some groups failed more. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lydia, for that concise summary of and the beginnings of the conversation. Could I turn first to Marinisha Sulman from the Health Foundation? Let's start with you. Are you there? Yes, there you
Hi.
are.
Yes, Marinisha.
Hi, lovely to see you, and thank you for joining us. You are working on a COVID impact report for the Health Foundation, and digging deeper into the different facets of the inequalities that are emerging of how COVID has affected us and who has been failed and to what measure. Would you start by giving us a picture of what you found so far?
Thank you so much, Marinisha, and thank you so much, Tortoise. This has been a fantastic inquiry so far. I logged into the sessions last week. Just to tell you a little bit about what we've been doing at the Health Foundation and the picture that's developing in terms of why the safety net has failed. What we're seeing is that we were unprepared as a nation and that the safety net wasn't spread to protect the most vulnerable. Experts like Professor Michael Marmot and others have been warning us for years about the deep divisions in our society in terms of health and well-being, and in particular, the economic and social assets that contribute to good health and well-being. And in terms of the inquiry that we're running, we're looking at the pre-pandemic infrastructure of society. What were people's health, social, and economic assets who, even prior to the pandemic, already were suffering the impacts of not having the opportunities to lead a healthy life? And what happened, what is happening, and what has happened during the pandemic itself in terms of whose assets have further eroded and what new inequalities are emerging. And in terms of who's been failed the most in all of these respects, it's we're seeing that people living with physical and learning disabilities, those from minority ethnic groups who are already affected in terms of poorer health outcomes, higher rates of heart disease, diabetes, respiratory disease, higher rates of unemployment, low wages, unsuitable housing, are not only further exposed to the virus itself and worse outcomes, but are also having their assets further eroded through the pandemic and lockdown measures. And what we're seeing is we know some of this information for people living with physical and learning disabilities, as well as some of the ethnic minority groups, though there are gaps in the data for these groups. What we're also seeing is that there are specific populations whose needs are very poorly documented. And these are groups like the homeless community, refugees, failed asylum seekers, and also those who have no recourse to public funds. We rely currently on people having touch points with our data architecture in order for us to even build a picture of need. And so what I would argue is that there are groups whose needs we have no clear picture of at all. The other big issue, Maripi, that we're finding in terms of the inquiry is the impact of the inadvertent infrastructure change in terms of access to healthcare services and financial services and other support, and what's happened with services moving online and the impact of digitally excluded groups and communities. I'll give you an example. In terms of the work that the Good Things Foundation did, we know that there are about 6.5 million people who don't use the internet, and a significant proportion of them are those who are living with disabilities, who are elderly, and who are from minority ethnic groups. And so what we see is that there is a compounding of inequalities that the pandemic has unraveled. I'll share with you a little bit of the deep dive that we're undertaking in terms of the impact of the pandemic on those living with physical and learning disabilities. As Professor Hayes said, these are groups who've been particularly affected, but we had a picture of the vulnerabilities prior to the pandemic. And this begs the question of why it is, despite us knowing the needs and vulnerabilities of certain groups, that we weren't better prepared. For example, those with learning disabilities, we knew are 4 times more likely to die of something which could have been prevented than the general population. This was done by the Disability Rights Commission a few years back. And then within the pandemic itself, both data from Public Health England as well as the Office for National Statistics show this alarming period between March and July, where disabled people made up almost 6 in 10 of all deaths involving COVID-19. And what we see is, aside from the mortality data, there's a wider picture on the social and economic impacts, where people living with physical and learning disabilities are less able to stay in work. They're more likely to have compounding physical and mental impacts, are unable to access healthcare services for either existing conditions or new conditions. And what we see is that disabled people are reporting more of an impact on their social well-being in terms of their relationships being affected, having access to shops, and reporting a higher rate of feeling unsafe outside the home. And what I'll end by saying is that what all of this shows in terms of the wider impacts on people's well-being is that the data we have is limited. We can't rely on just the numbers alone. We need the voices and the human experiences that will enable us to deeply understand the needs and divisions in our society. We do need further disaggregation of data, particularly when we're looking at the ethnicity data. I'm sure Halima will talk more about this. And also that we need to reframe the discourse, that this isn't an economic cost-benefit analysis about trade-offs or tragic choices between the health and the economy. Rather, it's a moral question about what we value as a society and the solidarity that's needed to ensure flourishing for everyone. And we need an approach in our country that defines our achievements as a nation, not in terms of GDP, but in terms of the opportunities that are open to everyone, particularly those who are facing inequalities before and are seeing further erosions of their opportunities now.
Thank you so much for that analysis. And I think what you say about how there are particular parts of society who aren't even touching the sort of data analysis of this is really, really interesting, and something that we'll definitely come back to. And actually, you mentioned homelessness, and I should say that one of our homeless members, Paul Aston, is here, and I'm hoping to come to him a bit later to talk about that experience, because I think you're right when you say that you need to go beyond those data points to the human stories to really get a good understanding of that. But first, you mentioned Sir Michael Marmot, who, as you said, has been warning us for years about divisions in our society and how unprepared we are for a moment like this. Hello there, Sir Michael Marmot. Can I start by asking you what you have seen as the impact of COVID-19 on the health inequalities we already experienced as a society, and who has been bearing the brunt?
Thank you. Well, I need to start before the pandemic happened for the reasons that you and Marinisha both said. The report that we produced in February this year, February 2020, if anybody can remember to pre-pandemic times, was called Health Equity in England, the Marmot Review 10 years on. And we looked at what had happened in the 10 years since we published the Marmot Review, Fair Society, Healthy Lives. And what we saw was a slowdown in improvement in life expectancy, dramatic slowdown. And in fact, the slowdown in the UK was more marked than in any other rich country except Iceland and the United States. And that's highly relevant. And is highly relevant to the COVID picture, which I'll come to in a moment. The second was increasing inequalities in health. If you classify people by where they live and the level of deprivation of the local authority, you see the social gradient. The more deprived the area, the shorter the life expectancy, and crucially, the shorter the healthy life expectancy. And that gradient, it got steeper. The inequalities, it got bigger. And the third feature, which was really alarming, we saw it for men and women, but particularly marked for women in the poorest 10% of areas outside London, life expectancy was going down. They're dying earlier and getting sicker. So that's where we were coming into the pandemic. And I have argued for a long time that the health of a society tells us a great deal about how well that society is functioning. Lydia talked about the rules of the game. I'm not quite sure I would have used that language, but I think we're talking about the same thing, how well the society is meeting the needs of its members. And inequalities in health tells us something fundamental about the inequalities in society. And that means that society wasn't working very well over the last decade, and the inequalities were growing. Then came the pandemic, and we had the highest excess mortality in Europe. As you know, there are difficulties in comparing COVID mortality rates across countries because of different ways the cause of death is assigned. Excess mortality looks at how many deaths you would have predicted in 2020 based on the previous 5 years. And then the number observed is the excess. And the excess mortality in England was higher than in Scotland and was higher than in any European country. We all look at the US and say it was absolute disaster, a failure of governance. The excess mortality in the UK was higher than in the US. Now, in a way, I'm speculating that the poor condition of society pre-COVID was linked to our failure to manage the pandemic appropriately. Now, how might that work? That's speculation, but I ask myself, what are you talking about? Well, I think I'm talking about four things. The first is governance. And how well a society is governed tells us a great deal about the society. I mean, it's a truism. We get the politicians we deserve. Well, bloody hell, look at what we ended up with. We must have done something. We must have offended the Almighty, or goodness knows what, to end up with a shower that we got. And look what the Americans did, what they ended up with. They must have really offended the powers up there. And then 73 million Americans said we'd like more of it for another 4 years. Good heavens, no wonder the pandemic is out of control. So our society wasn't working well, and we ended up with half the population going down a rabbit hole called Brexit that will damage us severely, and a set of politicians who can't govern from one day to the next. Yeah, a 23-year-old footballer has captured the imagination of the public better than our government has. He's got more moral agency on his side than the Prime Minister. And he beats the Prime Minister hands down. I'm talking about Marcus Rashford, of course. So I think the failure of governance is clear. And when we needed to lock down, we did it and did it too late. When we needed to take decisions, we weren't in a position to do it. I think the second way that operates is what Lydia and Marinisha have already referred to, is the deep-seated inequalities in society. And we can see that because what we've got is a social gradient in mortality from COVID-19 that looks almost identical to the social gradient in mortality from all causes, suggesting that the determinants of inequalities in COVID-19 overlap considerably with the determinants of health inequalities more generally. I say almost identical, but Lydia referred to the issues that make it even of greater disadvantage to be in deprived areas, employment in frontline occupations, overcrowded households, and the like. But we do see these inequalities. The third is we plundered public services over the last decade. The state was rolled back in 2009-10. 42% of GDP went on public expenditure. And over the next 10 years, that 42% became 35%. We rolled back the state. And that rolling back of the state was done in a sharply and neatly regressive way. If you look at spending in local government per person, for the least deprived 20% of areas, the spending in local government went down by 16%. And then the more deprived the area, the greater the reduction in spending. So in the most deprived 20%, it went down by 32%. Neatly regressive. The greater the need, the greater the reduction in spending. We just can't get away with that and expect there to be no bad consequences. And we can see the consequences: increased inequalities in health and stalling of life expectancy. Public health potentially has a very important role to play. The budget of Public Health England, after its establishment in 2012, was cut by 40%. And in the middle of a pandemic, the government said PHE isn't functioning properly. Well, they cut the budget by 40%. What about local public health? After the Health and Social Care Act, public health was moved into local government. The budget for public health was cut by about £800 million. So we set up a test, trace, and isolate system in the private sector, wrongly named the NHS system, and it didn't work. Instead of giving it to public health, put that money that you put into the private sector back into public health and let them do their job. They didn't do it. So the third of my four is failure of NHS funding to rise in line with inflation, cutting back to public health expenditure, stripping local authorities of funding. Our services were ill-equipped to deal with the challenge of a pandemic and the challenge of lockdown. And the fourth is we weren't very healthy. Health had stopped improving. We're getting sicker. And one of the risk factors for COVID-19 mortalities, pre-existing health conditions. And there was a lot of it about. So all of those put us in a poor position to manage the pandemic. And just like the prediction, we managed it very poorly. That's why we're in such a powerless situation. And then the effect of lockdown, for all the reasons that have already been said just now, will make those social and economic inequalities worse. And this is vital because the next step has to be thinking about building back. We're working with the Health Foundation, and on the 15th of December, we will publish a report with the support of the Health Foundation, Build Back Fairer, the COVID-19 Marmot Review. So we'll relook at our February 2020 report and look at it in the light of what COVID-19 and the associated societal response has done. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Sir Michael Marmot, for that contribution. Hopefully we'll get to come back to you at another point, but I feel first I should turn to Baroness Hilary Armstrong, if you're there. Hilary, if you are with us.
I am indeed.
Hello, lovely to see you. I wanted to talk to you about the findings from the Public Services Committee report, which highlights one particular group who suffered most. I mean, you know, we were talking in this very first session today about how it was almost impossible to pull out, you know, in the economy, one group that had felt the effects more than others because it's been so widespread. But you do have one particular group in mind who you feel that we as a society have let down more than others. Who are they?
Well, we took evidence from Michael Marmot and from the Health Foundation and from others who are represented today, and do reflect the discussion that you've just been having. But we also took evidence around children. And children, yes, did not actually suffer from the virus more than other groups, but vulnerable children suffered massively in terms of how services just left them invisible, really. And we know from the Children's Commissioner, she says that in 2019, there were about 2.3 million vulnerable children in this country, and that too many of them, even before the pandemic, went unnoticed, but they weren't picked up with their mental health needs, with their other needs, particularly if it was because they were in a family with domestic abuse or neglect and didn't have any really noisy, is the best word, noisy conditions that meant people took attention. But that the numbers have grown a lot. Only 1 in 10 of vulnerable children actually attended early years settings or school during the first lockdown. Now, they were all entitled to go, but for whatever reason, and you know, it doesn't take much imagination to think of why those children didn't end up going to school. Health visitors were largely not visiting homes. In some places they were being very cautious, but doing it. They didn't visit homes, so they weren't picking up very young children who might be subject to abuse or to neglect. Social workers weren't visiting. Because children weren't in school, nobody there was picking things up. So not only were they losing academically, but they were losing in all sorts of other ways. And the real issue is that is so difficult to pick up. And whatever additional thing that the public services do, it is going to be really difficult to compensate for the trauma, for the loss of attention, for the neglect that these children have endured during the pandemic. So I think that we have a crisis for the next generation, which we've laid the foundation of during the period of the pandemic. And we really are going to have to be extremely attentive. And I have to say the spending review is not very helpful because according to the IFS yesterday, it's really local government that is going to take the hit on that. And we already know that children's services for the most vulnerable are massively oversubscribed and under-resourced, and that a lot of the programs that we really need, which are community-based rather than care-based, if you see what I mean, that we don't want people, young children, to be drawn into the care system unless absolutely necessary, because the truth is we're not very good corporate parents. But we need those community services that have largely been stripped out of public services during the years of austerity. And the idea that we're not going to get those back, and we're not going to have a real, we need a real drive to integrate services so that schools are much more easily able to call on mental health services, for example, on trauma services for children who are in real difficulty. So this is the one that's scrabbling around the bottom with not much notice being taken of it, but which is building up massive problems for the future. And so what our committee recommends is that in this, and I have to say in other areas, we think our way through how we become much better at embedding preventative services into our systems, preventative services across the board, I have to say, but particularly for children and young people. And our funding mechanisms really don't help that at the moment. So we're going to be looking at that and looking at what we can do to embed prevention into our public service system. But we're also going to be looking at other things that we highlighted in the report, and some of those are around how we make sure that we compensate as much as possible for vulnerable children and what they've had to bear during the period of the pandemic.
Okay. Thank you so much for that. And I think it's fair to say that until Marcus Rashford came along, there probably wasn't enough focus on children for the reasons you say, which is that they weren't, health-wise affected by the virus. And so until recently, we haven't been having that conversation. I just thought I'd throw in a few statistics, which is the NSPCC had a 32% increase in calls to their helpline during lockdown. A Birmingham University study found referrals for child protection medical examinations, which are those examinations that look for signs of abuse. They dropped by 40% in lockdown, and there's a huge drop in cases going through the family courts. So in many ways, there's a whole sort of generation of children who are being impacted and not talked about. And actually, just before I move on, Hilary, do you feel that this is that we're looking at what we might call almost like a COVID generation of children who are going to miss out for life because of this 9-month, year-long, whatever we're going to end up being, 1 year, which will change the nature of this generation for their whole lives, that they'll be feeling the impact in 50 years?
Oh, there certainly is the prospect of that. I hope that government and others will take this seriously and bring as much remediation as possible. But as I say, if you lose this sort of activity and this sort of attention in your early years, you mainly pay for that for the rest of your life.
I'm just going to ask you a question from my colleague Giles Wittell, who I've just seen put in the gap. It says, what's the research that says a 9-month gap damages you for life? If we were going to look further into that, where would we begin?
Oh, I think Michael Marmot would be better at telling you this than me. I might have sociology in my history, but research data is not my strength, but I can just say that when I was doing early years in opposition way back in the 90s, there was lots of research about the number of children who started school behind others, often a year behind other children at 4 or 5, and they then spent the rest of their life, and certainly the rest of their school life, but the rest of their life trying to catch up. And there's lots of research around that. And I introduced a program called the Nurse Family Partnership, which was an evidence-based program way back in 2006-07, I think I introduced it when I was in government. And that was a program which intervened in a very significant way in pre-birth and the first 2 years of a child's life. And we could measure, the program had measured for 20 years, and they could actually measure until the child was 16, the improvement in outcomes over children who'd not been through the program. And that was a particular program for vulnerable children. And everybody that's used it in this country says it's wonderful, but of course, because of austerity, it's been cut back around the country. And there is now a voluntary organization that runs the program, but actually it's the whole thing that we know, and that, you know, for me, this is a tragedy. We know how to intervene effectively early on for children who will otherwise be vulnerable. And what we don't do is take the opportunity to do that and make their lives better, but also save us a heck of a lot of money in public services as the child grows up and becomes an adult. We're mad. We know how to do it, and we just don't invest.
Okay, thank you very much. So Mike, I'm wondering whether to come back to you briefly on that point, or if you have anything to add. Otherwise, I'll move on to Halima Begum. So Michael, just.
Yeah, sure. Baroness Armstrong's absolutely right. Firstly, can I say I didn't know that it was because of her that we have the Nurse Family Partnership, and I'm honored to share a platform with her because it's a most important intervention. So thank you. It's great. So 2 quick responses. Firstly, yes, it's readily available to get the data to document what's happening. We've been looking at routinely collected data on the % of children age 5 that have a good level of development using 13 indicators. It's collected at the end of reception, and you can get it. It shows a very clear relationship with deprivation. So it can be monitored, and it should be monitored in real time without mounting a huge research study. Second, there's good evidence. I shared a platform with somebody from UNICEF in Glasgow. Wherever you are, it's from your desk. So I get confused as to which part of the world I was in, because I was in London. But with somebody from UNICEF who works on adverse childhood experiences and the damage that ACEs do to children. And he was citing high quality randomized controlled trials that show you can intervene and make a difference to the damage caused by adverse childhood experiences. And what we're all talking about with lockdown, and what you're saying, Murabi, with the increase in calls to NSPCC, is an increase in adverse childhood experiences that will damage children. And the evidence is you can make a difference. And exactly as we've just heard, the funding for those programs had been cut over the last 10 years because of a misplaced idea that austerity is what the country needed. The austerity is why we got into this bad place.
Okay, thank you very much. Moving on, because I'm conscious of time. Dr. Halima Begum, who is from the Runnymede Trust. I hope you're with us. Hello there. For those who don't know Runnymede, it's the UK's leading independent race equality think tank. We've known since quite early in the pandemic, certainly since March, about the disproportional impact on BAME people of COVID. But you've been digging deeper into those figures at Runnymede. Can you tell us a bit about your findings?
Thanks, Mary P, and it's really great to be on this platform with others who have been digging into the data with us, though using their kind of gender lens, or maybe a health lens, or maybe the general inequalities lens, for example. So I did want to start with this point that those inequalities that we're discussing, which manifested themselves in inequalities in COVID today, in 2020, were already pre-existing. So there's nothing new there. And you've got Michael here, you've got the Health Foundation here. They've spent 30 years looking at these inequalities. What I suppose I would add to the mix here today, because what's happening today really does matter, because we're in the business of saving lives now and actually preventing more lives being lost in a pandemic, is the fact that we didn't really add race to the agenda. So there's a general sense that we talk about inequalities, we talk about the social determinants of health inequalities are very similar to what's now showing up in COVID. But what we're not saying is that actually race is also a singular factor that cannot just be explained by socioeconomics. And if we look at the COVID data in 2020, we will see that Black African people, Bangladeshi people are twice as likely, sometimes 3 times more likely to contract COVID and die. So that's not just a significant increase. Sorry, that's not just like a marginal increase. It's significant. It's the difference between life and death for those communities. So it's really, really important when we discuss pre-existing inequalities in health, and now we discuss what we do about COVID today and who has been most let down. I agree with the Baroness. Of course, our focus is on vulnerable children always, and children, whether they can articulate what their kind of severity of impact is or not, it is upon us to articulate that for them. So obviously children, vulnerable children come first, but beyond the vulnerability of children, BME groups have been impacted significantly. And there is no doubt about that. So I suppose what I want to reflect on now is a little bit about the specific way in which the UK has dealt with the impact of COVID for BME groups. We have known that BME groups have been impacted significantly. We've known this since March. Some of us felt this personally because before the Public Health England report came out, I'm from a British Bangladeshi family. I just became aware of lots of people within my networks who were affected with COVID. Question I asked back to my middle-class white friends was, oh, there's a lot of COVID about. Are you seeing that in Hertfordshire in the UK? Are you seeing that in other parts of the country? And they hadn't yet. So I thought, oh, either I know lots of people who are impacted by COVID personally, or there's a ethnicity pattern here. And of course, when the Public Health England report was made available, our worst fears came true. So it was very clear that COVID in the UK was moving and spreading across very racist groups. So the question now is, if we've always known this, why haven't BME groups therefore been prioritized as a vulnerable group, for example? Like, why haven't BME groups been considered to be a vulnerable group across all age groups, for example? So what we now see is that the government has applied a very colorblind policy to its COVID response, despite knowing that it's BME groups that have been most vulnerable, obviously with over 50-year-olds as well. And that really worries me, because if we've always known since March that these groups are vulnerable, and we're in the middle of a second wave and the winter months are with us, this is not an inquiry like Grenfell where we're looking back to see what lessons can be learned. We are still trying to learn those lessons real time so we can actually save more lives. So our research with the Institute of Public Policy Research, IPPR, showed that actually if we had paid attention to the risk factors that ethnicity brings in, we might have actually, now I need to just look back at that number, we might have actually saved 2,500 more lives of BME groups. So it's very important that we also look at ethnicity as a risk factor. And so far, Michael, we haven't. A lot of our health inequalities data, yes, if you dig down, you'll see that a lot of these groups are BME groups. But it was really, really important in 2020, the year that we all watched George Floyd be murdered on television in the US, that we actually didn't kind of skirt around those issues. So we actually laid bare those issues around racial inequalities that then impact health outcomes. That we actually acknowledged that that might be a reason why BME groups have been more vulnerable. Now, you've all heard a lot of slogans being bandied about. BME groups are overexposed, is what we'll keep hearing. I just wanted to explain what that overexposure meant. The overexposure relates to the gig economy roles, the fact that BME groups are concentrated in jobs that are insecure, that are more precarious. We have to use the bus, we haven't been furloughed as much, so we can't stay at home. Somebody has to go and get the food and put it on the table. So all of these factors externally overexpose BME groups. You've also heard that BME groups are underprotected. So on the one hand, they're overexposed and then they're underprotected. And what does underprotection mean? Somebody talked about a lack of timely PPE equipment, for example, for sure. But we also refer to BME people having not being listened to at work, for example, around health and safety standards. We also talk about BME groups not really having the same equality of voice in the workplace. So lacking voice for us means actually there's a racial effect, there's a racism effect within the workplace. And so we need to talk about the racism, otherwise we can't really talk about protecting groups and making them safe. So it's very important that we understand that BME groups have been overexposed and underprotected, and underprotected comes with a conversation around racism. So if we can get to grips with this reality and that data, I think we can cut to the chase and figure out some solutions that will actually make sense this year. And none of those solutions, by the way, are complex. They're not solutions that relate to genetics. They're not solutions that relate to how you mitigate the additional risk of underlying health conditions. Those solutions are pretty much the same solutions that you find in Singapore, same solutions that you find in South Korea. They're actually solutions that require government to start looking at protecting households and families with more support and measures, and also obviously protecting the economy. So far in this country, we've seen probably a greater effort at protecting economic loss and economic assets, but we haven't really looked at the protection of households and families and people who are suffering from COVID. So I just had 4 solutions that I just wanted to throw out there, and they're really, really simple. They're nowhere near as complex as how do you get a vaccine. First solution is essentially to offer isolation pay, for example, for individuals who have COVID, right? Second solution is, what about temporary housing accommodation for people who have COVID that cannot isolate? BME groups tend to live in overcrowded households, multi-generational households. Well, what's the solution there? Just provide isolation facilities as they do in South Korea. I mean, that takes resources, of course, but that's what we're asking. Shift some of that resource and money to local authorities and to the communities. Michael, you talked a bit about rolling back of the states. Of course, that's been going on for 20 years. Baroness Armstrong, you talked about getting the community on the front line with the response. But that goes hand in hand, doesn't it? You can't just roll back the state and then kind of concentrate all that money on track and trace at a national level. All the countries that have successfully dealt with COVID at the moment, they've actually targeted resource straight to the community, straight to local authorities. And here we have a government whose macroeconomic policies focused at national level response. What we do know about Ebola, what we do know about earthquake disasters and other disasters across the world is that the community is best placed to get to the responses as quickly as possible. But that requires this government to shift its ideology and just focus on a pandemic, not the politics. What we also say is that there's a lot of people who are undocumented migrants in this country who also don't have access to treatment because they have to pay for it. But we know that the pandemic doesn't just suddenly stop because you have a passport or you don't have a passport. So we do need to look at the hostile environment policies and do something about that. My kind of message here is not to think about what are the lessons that we can learn in the last 20 years, how can we learn from what we already know, how can we dig more into the data. We as an organization have produced data on ethnicity and inequality for 50 years. Do not get lost and distracted with more data. Do not get lost with data paralysis. You do know what the situation is. We do know what needs to happen. We need to make sure that we apply as much pressure on this government to bring about more political will to put in place measures that South Korea has done and other countries. Now, each country is different, of course, but we do need to think about those lessons real time right now and protect further BME groups from dying in this second wave.
Thank you so much for that, Halima. And again, if we've got time, I will try and come back to you, but I am conscious of time, and I just like to move on, like I said I would at the start, to Paul Aston, who is, as I said, he's homeless and he's a Tortoise member, and he actually submitted a witness statement to the inquiry. And I'm just going to, if I may, Paul, just read a little edited chunk of it, just because I thought it was interesting, and you can elaborate. You say, undoubtedly the worst impacts of the COVID lockdown occurred for the homeless. If you'd read the media headlines in the first few weeks of lockdown 1, you'd think we'd solved the problem of homelessness. In part, that was true. Money was no object. Bureaucratic barriers had been removed. Those homeless on the streets were the only news story, and being placed front and centre to the public eye, and finally being offered accommodation, albeit in the short term. But after the first 3 months, people experiencing homelessness found themselves out of the media and out of their accommodation. Even though there was an eviction ban in lockdown 1, another 20,000 people became street homeless, many for the first time. We have 20,000 evictions going through the courts and another 25,000 waiting, and 250,000 people in rent arrears. But the worst impact is that people who were given hope and then had it taken away. And that's just a small bit of your statement that I've pulled out there. Paul, will you tell us a bit about your experience?
Yeah, so as many people know, I was in Heathrow Airport Terminal 5, sleeping as I have been for the past 2 years, when the announcement of lockdown came out. And then for the first 2 or 3 weeks, we didn't hear from any charities. I sort of became very much the spokesperson for what I hashtagged the Heathrow Homeless. And eventually on the 1st of April, a bunch of charities came out to the airport and said, we're going to find you accommodation. Now, this obviously after Sadiq Khan's 300 rooms announcement and Boris Johnson's will get everybody in by the weekend announcement. But once we were inside, it was, again, it was just a postcode lottery of where you ended up. So some people ended up in East Croydon. I ended up in a hotel travel lodge over at Liverpool Street Station, but then challenged Westminster because I've been a registered homeless voter in Westminster Council for 6 years. So they then said, okay, we'll put you in our borough. And one of the big reasons for that is that you're terrified of losing local connection with a local authority. It's one of the parameters by which they'll assist. You have to prove a local connection to that authority. But we were then told we were inside till the 3rd of July. And this changed everything because suddenly people were getting food that they'd previously not got food. People had facilities that they hadn't had before. The biggest difference was that a lot of people that would have previously avoided charities like Crisis and St Mungo's, they're not particularly well liked amongst the homeless community, were prepared to take a risk because people's names weren't being taken. It was literally people turned up, said I'm homeless, and then they were housed. And it changed the dynamic of housing people literally overnight. So that was huge, and people were inside. But again, it was a postcode lottery. Some people were getting fed, some people weren't, some people getting mental health care, some people weren't. A lot of the people in the accommodation I was in were thrown out within the first week, a bigger chunk in the second, and then things settled down. And these people were being thrown out for breaches of things like taking drugs on the premises, drinking alcohol on the premises, smoking on the premises, all these things that they would have are expected, especially with addictions, just to stop, which was a ludicrous proposition. However, since the 3rd of July, pretty much everybody's back out. There was 225 of us, I think, in Westminster that were taken in under everyone in. There were only 7 of us that could make a claim to local connection. And I've been battling with Westminster Council ever since with a sword of Damocles, because they can literally get you out within 24 hours, up until 2 days ago, where I've been given my eviction date as the 6th of January, 2021. But yeah, across the country, every council is different, every borough is different. Even here in London, Westminster appears to be the worst. Haringey taking over vacant occupation of empty properties have been left empty for a year or more. Islington's kind of a halfway house. So it is a real mishmash, and there's no clear strategy. And the big problem now, of course, is that lockdown 1 meant that the only news story was the homeless. Lockdown 2, nobody seems to give any interest in it whatsoever, except of course yourselves.
Thank you, Paul. Look, I'd love to stay with you, but I'm also conscious that thank you for your story. Thank you for your witness statement. Thank you for taking the time to be with us. There's one more voice I was hoping to hear from, someone else who contacted the inquiry. Is Lobby Akinola there?
I'm here.
Hello, Lobby. Thank you for getting in touch. Would you tell us your story?
Sure. So I lost my father to the pandemic in the end of April 26th. He was working as a care assistant for MenCap. So he worked with the people with learning difficulties in the local area in the West Midlands. And we had problems, I believe, because with the 111 health service, he called the service, I think, about 3 times, trying to just understand what he was supposed to do. And each time he had been told to stay at home. There was a point when they did refer him to his GP because he commented that he was starting to find blood in his phlegm and that he was coughing up. And they prescribed him some antibiotics, but told him to still stay at home and continue resting. And then unfortunately, a few days later, he passed away at home. So I think just kind of building from what's been spoken about today is things about the inability to find PPE for people working with vulnerable people, and also just whether or not how the health service was necessarily fit to, well, the 111 service was able to assess people's severity and their need via that method. Especially one thing we had a question about is because after my father passed, my mother called 111 to try and get herself a test so she could find out if she had COVID, and what she was obviously concerned. I'm the oldest of 5 children. She was concerned what was going to happen to her kids. And one of the questions they asked her to see whether or not she qualified for a test is whether or not her lips were blue. And she had, her response was she doesn't know. So we had like questions about the appropriateness of the 111 health service and also the method that being used to quantify and assess whether or not people were in need of medical care and how that applies to people of color, especially well, for our family, Black people.
You're echoing, not just what was said in one of our earlier sessions last week, but obviously some of what Halima said about the sort of colorblind approach to to the pandemic. We have in fact gone over time, so I'm just going to return briefly to Lindsay to see if she has closing thoughts before I try and sum up. Hello, Lindsay. I don't know if you have any closing thoughts.
Hi, sorry, it's Lydia. That's I wasn't sure. Yeah, no, it's fine. Lobby, I'm so sorry for your loss. Thank you for sharing. Those points are so important. We've covered a huge amount of ground, but what rings through is the commonality of these issues, as Halima has said, about we know what needs to be done to put this right. The issues to do with community, about tackling things in localities, about recognizing the impact of racism, about ensuring that people are protected and supported adequately. And it's such an important point that we are learning as we are going. And that means that, that not paying attention is costing lives, not taking action is costing lives. We do not have the luxury to be able to look back on this in years to come when there's a change of government or whatever. And it's so important that each of us do what we can to push for the political will to make the changes that so obviously need to be made.
Thank you so much, and thank you for starting us with that. I think it was Wilkinson and Pickett quote at the start about, how the more equal the society, the greater the problems experienced. And it's quite obvious from our conversation that, you know, the poor condition of our society as we entered this pandemic is linked to our ability to manage COVID-19 effectively. You know, that there's a lot for a tortoise to pick up on there, but I was struck by a few things, Marinisha's points about how some people, some of the very worst affected, aren't even coming into contact with the data points that we need to find out their stories and subsequently report on them. Those people who once everything went online can't access those services online. Those people we don't even have a picture of. So I think that that's something really important for tortoise to look at. Obviously, Sir Michael Marmot talked about how the people whose assets had already been eroded felt the effects of it worst of all, and the rolled back state that has hit the most deprived areas of the country in the last few years. They've borne the worst of the brunt of it, not to mention the already stalling life expectancy, that when you hit a pandemic, you really see the full effects of it here. Halima, you talked about the colorblind approach to the pandemic and how we talk about age, and in fact looking ahead at the vaccine. When you see who's first in line to get the vaccine, it's a conversation about age, and it's only about age. And it would be interesting for us to do some work about whether the approach to the vaccine should be colorblind. I think you do have some opinions on that. You know, what with Marcus Rashford's campaign, it's impossible to not come away from this and listening to Baroness Armstrong to talk about that generation, that vulnerable generation of children, the COVID generation, who are going to feel the effects of this experience of this last year for years to come. And I think that is something that we will want to take away from this, that, you know, only 1 in 10 attended early setting or school in that first lockdown. And that's a really shocking statistic. So thank you all for joining us and helping us get to the bottom of who was failed. Please join us for the next session, which starts, I believe, in next 10 minutes now. Stay on the Zoom link because I've overrun, and we look forward to seeing you there.